So this one, Capitalism and the History of the Modern Family, as I said, is sort of an overview talk. This lecture appears in a written form if you want to have that. If you Google Capitalism and the Family and my last name, you probably will find this. It appeared in the Freeman, the publication, the Foundation for Economic Education. If you don't, by the way, know the Foundation for Economic Education, that is a good organization to get to know. Their website is simple, foundationforeconomiceducation.org. They do really, really good work. Thank you. They do really, really good work. And they also have student seminars that you can attend if you can get yourself to the U.S. They have wonderful seminars. So. Orange juice is good. All right. I had enough caffeine to start the day, so no more caffeine and I'll start throwing things. So, let me start this talk with a kind of overview of the argument I want to make. And the argument essentially is the following. That prior to the emergence of capitalism, the family, by the way, like much else in society, was not an especially nice place. Okay? Especially families, if you were a woman and to some degree child, the family was not an especially nice place. What we know, and what we usually think highly of as the modern family, and I'll talk about what we mean by that, is it's a product of a number of things. But certainly capitalism, the advent, the fact that we have a capitalist economy, is a key part of what made possible that modern family. And this is a fact, I think, that makes both progressives and conservatives uncomfortable. That is, it makes the modern left and modern right uncomfortable. And let me say why. If it's true that the modern family, and particularly the sort of freedom to form the kinds of families that we like, and the sort of variety of family forms that we see today as part of the modern family, if that is to some degree due to both the structure of capitalism and the wealth that capitalism created, you can see why that might cause problems for both people on the right and the left. For conservatives, who, at least U.S.-type conservatives, who claim, anyway, to love markets and capitalism, they tend to not like all of the flourishing freedom of the family. They tend to think that we need to go back to, quote, the traditional family, whatever that means. And so for them, the idea that the capitalism that they say they like produced all of these options within the family that they think are not so good, right? You can see that might cause them a problem. And the same on the left, right? On the left, people who really value, and I think rightly, the variety of family forms that we have now, I think that's great. To argue that that's somehow this, distinctly a product of capitalism might make some of them uncomfortable too. Okay? So I think, to me, the fact that this argument makes both groups uncomfortable is one of its greatest strengths, because I like arguments that make lots of people uncomfortable. So that's another part of this. And then finally, I think what is nice about this argument is that it's consistent with liberalism, with classical liberalism. This idea that the freedom that comes with economic behavior in markets and capitalism should be part of a process that creates greater options and greater freedom in social processes. It seems like a good thing. It seems, again, the sort of thing that liberals think is the way things ought to work. Okay? So those are some things to think about as I work through this argument this morning. Let me start by talking about how we might define the modern family, and there is one modern family. If you think babies and dogs talk, at least it's a modern family. So what do we mean by the modern family? One feature of the modern family is that marriage is by choice and by love. And it's important to distinguish those two things. We often treat them as the same. We compare modern marriages to arranged marriages. An arranged marriage, right, is a marriage that the people getting married don't have a choice in, right? That it's been arranged by someone else. Okay? But you can choose your marital partner, so it's not an arranged marriage, but you might choose to marry them for reasons other than love. So we need to distinguish between marriage by choice and marriage by love. Historically, marriages were neither, for most of human history, were neither by choice nor by love. and that changed over time, that marriages now, at least again, in the Western world, are largely by choice and by love. And we'll talk about that in process. Another feature of the modern family is that the family is nuclear, private, and insulated. And what I mean by that is we think of the family as being this sort of distinct unit, right? It's mom, dad, and the kids. That's the nuclear part. It's private, okay? The other institutions in society, largely, though not completely, respect its privacy. And it's insulated. It protects itself from those institutions. You can think of a man's home as his castle sort of argument. That phrase has been used oftentimes to justify some bad things, but there is something true about it, right? The idea that home and family life is different from the market, it's different from the state, it's a separate sphere of activity. Third, children are sentimentalized and childhood is sheltered, right? We have this distinct thing we call childhood, and we shelter children for the most part from the outside world, from the world of work, from the public world. And we sentimentalize childhood, right? We treat children as uniquely valuable assets. And that, it's almost Christmas time, right? We sort of think about all of those images we have of children in Christmas. And all those kinds of ways we sentimentalize childhood are uniquely modern. Childhood historically wasn't like that. We've made it that way. And then finally, the equality of the sexes and the idea that women have significant financial independence. Whether we're totally equal remains a good question, but much more equal than we used to be, and how, in the ways that this has also produced an increase in the level of divorce. One of the features of the modern family is it's much more prone to divorce than families were historically, and we'll talk some about why that is, and we can certainly talk about whether the goods and bads of that. Right? So that's what we mean by the modern family. So what I want to do is I'm going to now go backwards and talk about the pre-modern family, that is the pre-capitalist family, right? And then talk about the ways in which the advent of capitalism changed things that got us from that pre-modern family to the modern family. Okay? So, what do we mean by the pre-modern family? The key to understanding the pre-modern family is that the family was first and foremost an economic institution. We don't think of it really that way today. We tend to think of the family as a place where people receive emotional or psychological satisfaction, right? That's the thing that it does. But historically, in fact, the family was an economic institution. Why is that, or why was that? The key is that the household was the unit of production. The people who lived within the household contributed to that household's economic activity. The same way we think about a firm today as producing and selling stuff on the marketplace and bringing income in. That's what families did that for most of human history. Households did, right? The obvious example is a farming family, a farming household that grows stuff on the farm, sells it at the market, brings stuff in, right? The family is the firm. The family is the unit of production. But even small crafts, right? Cottage industries and smiths and things like that, right? Were family-based, all right? And that occupations were tied up with the household. Key to this, of course, is that family members contributed to production. Women, children, other, sometimes grandparents, all were part of the production process. Right? What they did was help produce, whether if it was a farm products or the crafts or whatever it might be. Again, mostly agricultural, and I assume this is true I don't know other languages for sure, but certainly in English. There's a very important piece of evidence we have that families were historically connected up with work. Anyone know what it is? Maybe I assume it's true in other languages. In fact, I know it is to some. How do we know that people's work and family used to be the same thing? There's a remnant of that today.
Last names.
Last names, yes. Right? Again, I'm going to use English examples, but think about all the last names of people that are jobs. Baker, butcher, brewer. Those are all last names in English. Right? All the Smiths, right, were all jobs. Coopers were people who made barrels. Right? Fletchers made arrows. The little feathers on the back of arrows. So all of these last names were also work that people did. And oftentimes, if your name was John Smith, you were John the Smith, right? So we know this. The last name still exists today, right, as a sort of vestige, a remnant of that past, where our work and our family were the same thing. And what's interesting today, of course, when you meet someone new, okay, never met before. You're introduced to them, and they give you, you learn their name, and then you often ask them, well, what do you do, right? And for most of human history, you wouldn't have asked that question because their name would have told you, for the most part, what it is that they do. But now those two things have nothing to do with each other. So last names, okay? The other thing to remember at this, pre-capitalism, is that the vast majority of people were poor. They lived at the margins economically. People's economic survival was a day-to-day affair. The story of human history is a story of humanity being consistently and persistently poor until the last 200 years. So it's important to remember that the decisions that people made about who to marry and how many kids to have and how to organize their families were economic decisions that often mattered for their survival. Their survival both as a family, but also the survival of their community, right? I mean, if you married wrong, right, and that may have affected your ability to grow crops, which in turn might have affected the ability of your community to survive. So marriage and family decisions had these economic elements to them that had, the way language we use today, had external costs and external benefits, like all kinds of external consequences to the rest of the community. Which is why, by the way, the rest of the community often cared a great deal about who you married and how you chose to live your family life. Less true today, of course. Okay? The family, though, was also a political institution, particularly for the better, the well-off. Okay? If you were well off, who you married had a great deal of importance for forming political alliances, for accessing political power. If you were poor, who you married mattered because it was a way to tap into a larger network of cooperation and community. One of the great things about getting married is that suddenly your spouse's family becomes your family. And you extend the number of people who care about you and who care about your children. And that's kind of a productive activity, right? That's important. That marriage brought these kind of political and economic benefits to it. For wealthy people, though, it was often a matter of making sure you married into the right family so you had access to political power. If you know Shakespeare plays, so many Shakespeare plays are about the sort of politics of marriage. In the last lecture, I mentioned Monty Python and the Holy Grail to an audience that hasn't seen it. But again, for the three of you who have, you can think of the wedding scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail as being an example of farcical example of the sort of relationship between marriage and the concern about economic and political power. So for the pre-modern family, right, family was a lot of things that it isn't today. In addition, okay, hang on 1 second. Well, we can contrast this with what we think of as now the modern family. Okay? Historically, right, marriage was arranged, but even if it was chosen, it was not primarily about love. Okay? So again, this is this distinction between arranged marriages and marriages for love. Even if people chose who to marry, right, the economic and political considerations were the largest feature. Love was secondary. Love was a sort of frivolity of the rich. Only the rich could afford to marry for love. And oftentimes they didn't marry for love. They married for politics, but they had other relationships for love. Right? Love is what you and your mistress had, not what you and your wife had. Your wife was too important to worry about love. Okay? And same with your husband, right? I mean, that seems a strange sentence for us today. But when the economic and political considerations dominated, you couldn't afford to marry for love. I don't know if you guys know this movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Anyone know this movie? Okay? Yeah. Big Fat Greek Wedding is a great story about the difference between modern and pre-modern notions of marriage, right? Because they want her to marry a Greek guy, right? And that's what you do. And it wasn't about love. If you remember the scene where the main character and her mom are sitting in the kitchen and she says to her mom, I want to marry Ian Miller, right? Because she loves him. And what does the mom say? Like, that's silly. Tula, go eat something, right? You're being silly marrying for love, right? That's a silly thing to do. Okay? But here you see the contrast, right? The contrast between, again, marrying for love versus these other values that people might have had. Right? Women, of course, were awfully near property. All right? The powers that husbands had over their wives were significant. Married women, in particular, were affected by what were called coverture laws. Okay, and the idea behind coverture laws was something like the following: that the identity of a married couple was the husband. That when women got married, their identity as economic beings was folded into the identity of their husbands. They were one unit, and that unit was the husband. So, for example, in Great Britain and the United States, for a long period of time, married women could not own property or enter into contracts. Right? They did not have their own independent identity economically and to some degree, significant degree, politically. Right? We know about women's suffrage and the right to vote. What's less known are the ways in which, over roughly the same period of time, women, married women in particular, gained a whole bunch of economic rights that they didn't have. And you can see why this notion of women's identity being covered by their husbands, that they did not have a separate identity outside of that of the unit, was such a dangerous thing, not just economically by denying women the opportunity, married women, to own property and so on. You can also see how that might have affected male-female relationships. For example, for a long period of time, it was considered legally impossible for a man to rape his wife. Why? Because if she was married to him, they were part of the same unit, therefore she had consented to whatever he chose to do. Right? The notion of a sort of separate act of consent for having sex with your husband didn't matter. You had consented by marrying him. You were one, and the one was the husband. And only in the 20th century, really, did those laws begin to change, particularly as we began to undo the economic basis of coverture laws, we began to undo the other implications it had as well. Even within the family, we think about farm families and so on, you can think about husbands, fathers as being the CEO of the production unit, and women and children as being assets, capital goods, to go back to the first lecture, right, that were allocated as needed. Okay? They simply did not have much economic identity of their own. When we look at children, of course, children again were largely seen in this way as economic assets. The standard story people tell, of course, that children were important for two reasons. One, they were labor. They could work a farm, let's say, or they could work in a cottage industry. And that when you got old, your children would provide you with old age support. Especially if you had a farm, okay, and you couldn't retire. You just kept working until you literally couldn't manage the farm anymore. So typical thing was, again, no such thing as retirement. So when we think about old age and those sorts of things, we have to think about how the realities of that economy played into it. The other thing to think about, of course, is that if you are having lots of children and you are a woman, you are dealing with multiple pregnancies. It was often the case that for many women, historically, they were either pregnant or nursing most of their sort of fertile adult life. Okay, they either were in the process of having a kid or had just had one. It's also the case that a much larger number of children died before either age 1 or age 5 than is the case today. One of the great triumphs of the last 100 years, 150 years, is the dramatic reduction in infant mortality. Of all the things that have improved human life, that's perhaps the greatest. And it is the thing that's responsible for the extension of life expectancies. If you understand how life expectancy statistics work, normally we talk about life expectancy at birth. So you hear these data, people say, in the 19th century, average life expectancy was 35 or 40, and you think to yourself, wow, there must not have been very many old people then, because everyone, the average person died at 35 or 40. That's not what that statistic means. What that statistic means is, at the moment you're born, right, on average, how long are you likely to live? And what you have to remember is, lots of kids died before age 1 or age 5. And so all of those sort of, less than 1s and less than 5s average in and pull that life expectancy down. That low average life expectancy is a function of that high infant mortality rate. And when you lower the infant mortality rate, you raise average life expectancy. So there were a fair number of old people historically, right? But that was being dragged down by the large number of kids who died from disease in particular early on. And so for pre-modern families, right, the reality of life was death. The reality of having kids was that half of those children you had might well die before they reached 18. It was not uncommon for families to have 2 children with the same first name. Why? Because parents would name multiple kids with the same name because they knew, they thought anyway, that only one of them might survive. So if you wanted to make sure you had a kid named John, right, you had to make sure you named 2 John just to play safe, to make sure one made it to adulthood, right? Again, today that doesn't even cross our mind, right? And we think today about the death of the child is the worst thing that can happen to a parent, okay? It's the worst horror that you can imagine. But for most of human history, it was simply reality. And there's an interesting debate about whether this made parents less sentimental about their children, right? How sentimental could you be, right, when you were constantly worried about the reality of your kids, not just possibly dying, but probably dying? I keep forgetting to put it into this presentation, but I have a shot of a headstone, a gravesite in Louisiana from the 19th century, and there's 5 children's names listed on it, and you look at it, and they all died before age 9 or something like that from the same family, right? So and I'm sure, by the way, in Vilnius, if you go around to some cemeteries in Vilnius, given how old the city is, you'll find similar kinds of things, right? Where you see families buried together, if they can afford it, where children had a number of children all died at the same time. One of the most fundamental changes in the family in the last 150 years is, again, the fall in infant and child mortality rates that have transformed the family. Lastly, pre-modern families were public institutions. What I mean by that was that the church, the state, and the community had a stake in the decisions that families made. Right? You can think of the Scarlet Letter and all these kinds of things. But people's behavior about who they married and how they married and what they did with their kids were very high stakes to the community. And the community, in the form of the church and the state, and sometimes those were indistinguishable, had a role, had their hands in those decisions, even to the point of, you were expected to spy on your neighbors and so forth to make sure that they were behaving appropriately in all kinds of ways. Okay? Let me note something that hasn't changed, though. Okay? What hasn't changed is the role that family plays as an indispensable transmitter of cultural norms and values. Families have always done this, right? And I don't want this talk to be misunderstood that I'm somehow arguing families today aren't as important or aren't necessary to see the direction I'm going to go in a bit. But I want to insist early on in this talk that we need families, and that while sometimes it's helpful if the village is helping raising a child, the village, in Hillary Clinton's words, can't raise children by themselves. We need families. We need the intimacy of families to do that for reasons that we can talk about. But it's through the family that we learn to navigate, navigate culture, to navigate the world, and it's the parents teaching their children that's crucial. And I think that parents are in a position to do that better, though not only, but better than schools and churches and other kinds of places. Okay, so now we get to the big question. What did capitalism do? There's 2 things that capitalism did that transformed the family. The first, I'll tell you what they were now. The beginning of wage labor, people working outside the family. And secondly, the wealth that capitalism created. So, what did wage labor do? With the rise of the factory system, early in the development of capitalism in the 19th century, factories hired non-family. For the first time in human history, a significant number of people began to earn their living outside of the family. This separated home and work in a significant way. Right? It started to take the economic role of family, of the household, away. Right? Families were increasingly not the site of production. Factories and other forms of work outside the family were. So again, it's my sort of standard factory shot there that you can see what's happening. This is key, right? Because this changes the family. No longer is the family primarily about economic relationships. Okay? Your economic relationship was with your employer, who was someone else. And if you know your Marx, right, this is a key part of Marx's story, of course, that this was part of people no longer owning the means of production themselves, but being reliant upon working for other people who own the means of production. And he's right about that. That's sort of historically that happened. But one of the things that did was to help change the nature of the family from the site of production to something else. What this factory system also did is increase over time, people's wealth. Right? The wages available to factory workers began to rise as their productivity increased, as the capital they used was more productive. Factory workers began to see higher and higher wages. A bunch of things happened as a result of this that mattered for the family. Okay? One of them is that family size shrank. As parents could earn additional income, more income in the factory than they could working on the farm, right? Parents began to realize they didn't need to have kids to help earn income. They didn't have the farm to manage or whatever else it might be. And so we see family size start to shrink. The average number of kids people have begins to fall. And this demographic fact is one of the great demographic facts across the globe, right? As economic growth and development, as industrialization in particular takes place, family size tends to shrink, and it's happened almost everywhere. Which is just a good lesson in that people respond to incentives. It also suggests that the reason why people have large families still today, right, we think of parts of the world that have not developed as much economically, tend to have larger families. They're having larger families not because they're somehow irrational or they don't know how to use birth control or something like that. They're doing it because it's actually probably rational for them to have larger families. From an economic perspective, having more children gives them assets in a way that works for them. If you think, if the way to generate smaller families isn't to go around the world handing out condoms, right? It's economic growth. And why even well-meaning Westerners who tried to bring birth control to parts of the world with large families, right, go back in a few years and discover that the condoms have become water balloons, right, and so not being used for the purpose they were intended. Okay, are sort of surprised and disappointed. They shouldn't be, right? People are pretty good at managing their own affairs, and if they're having a certain number of children, it's probably because they need them. Not 100%, but probably because they need them. And we see, again, consistently, as economic growth and development takes place, family size shrinks. And it shrinks because people begin to, again, use more contraception. And by the way, my students seem to think that contraception was invented sometime in the 1960s or 70s, right? No, actually, human beings have been trying to prevent pregnancy as long as they realized sex felt good and that pregnancy was challenging. Okay, just old forms of contraception just weren't very good. That was the problem. All right? Modern ones are much better. But again, why would people want better forms of contraception? Because they want fewer kids, and part of that is that they want to have fewer kids who they invest more in. Go back to our conversation in the last lecture about human capital. Parents recognize that in this now sort of world in which things like education and your skills matter for your productivity, the opportunities that capitalism made available, right? Investing in your kids' education was important, and you were wealthy enough to afford to do that. Okay? One of the things, right, I say to my students, you've wasted the first 22 years of your lives, right? You've produced nothing. You sit around and do stuff like this all day and listen to people talk. Right? You don't produce anything. Well, we can afford that, right? As a society, we have enough wealth that we can afford to invest in young people and to invest in their human capital in the ways that we do. Right? For most of human history, we couldn't afford to do that. We needed kids to work, and this is why kids worked in the factory, and it's still why we see child labor in places across the globe. Right? It's because families needed that income, and when families don't need that income anymore, kids and wives, by the way, historically, come out of the factories and back into the home. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. The other major thing that happens here, so is that, again, women and children come back to the house, right? Early industrialization, women and children worked in the factories. As wages rose, their income wasn't as necessary. They slowly came back home. Of course, women have since gone back out into the workforce in a very different way. And marriage slowly becomes more and more about love. Or more precisely what happens is the love-based marriage, which was something of, exclusive to upper classes, begins to work its way through the middle class down to the working class. That marriage increasingly becomes about love. When it matters less economically who you marry, you can afford to marry for love. And so what we see is not just, first we see marriage as a choice, but the choices people made were often choices based upon the ability, the sort of human capital combination of the couple, right? Their ability to produce together, when that's what families did. But once families were no longer the site of production, marriage could focus on love. If you think about romantic relationships today, right, and you think about who you might marry or who you might have a relationship with, right, what's the basis of that relationship today? It's usually commonalities in your consumption preferences. We both like to ski. We read the same books. We like the same movies. We like to go out to eat together. Right? That's all consumption stuff. Right? What you don't think to yourself is, boy, he'd make a great work partner. Right? Look at those shoulders. He can lift stuff. Or look at her shoulders. She can lift stuff. But again, historically, those kinds of things mattered to some significant degree. When marriage was an economic partnership, right, those things matter. The historian of marriage, Stephanie Kuntz, describes this as marriage went from being yoke mates to soul mates, right? From workmates to lovers. And so marriage slowly becomes increasingly about love. And that's important for a whole bunch of reasons we'll come back to later. And finally, childhood changes, as I've suggested before. With fewer children, with children more likely not to die young, and children being educated, going to school, we begin to create this sheltered childhood, as some of the historians of childhood call it. This place where childhood is this separate stage where kids are sheltered from the world of work and all these other kinds of things, and sort of in this bubble, we sometimes call it, this bubble of education, school and college and all these sorts of things. And we sentimentalize childhood in ways that we didn't before. And what else happens here is, along with the advent of democracy, which we can talk about here as having a role in the change in the family too, this privatizes the family. And I put that word in quotes. What I really mean here, and again, there's our family in the home, sort of the private nuclear family. The state, the church, and the community are all slowly restrained, that their ability to intervene in the family becomes less and less over time. That families, particularly husbands, but families to some degree, begin to have rights that they can exercise against the state, against the church, against the community. No, you can't do that. This is our private space. Again, a man's home is his castle kind of thinking here too. So all of these things transform the family. And you can notice, by the way, if you look at pictures of old families and old households, you can see this transition. At one point, right, oftentimes the household would have in it, older pictures, portrayals, a household would have in it what I would call production goods, a loom maybe, or something that was about production. But now, when we begin to think about families by the 19th century, and certainly our own families today, think about your house, right, that you grew up in. It's full of consumption stuff, probably, right? It's the things you consume. And families, households are sites of consumption rather than production. So this is a fundamental transformation of the family that begins to happen as industrialization and capitalism become central. One of the most important things that happened, though, was the way in which these changes led to changing roles for women. And I think the way I would put this is the most important demographic fact of the 20th century in the Western world is the changing role of women, particularly the changing role of women in the workforce. So one of the things we need to talk about is, and there's some working women, the growth in female labor force participation rates over the 20th century. What's interesting about that picture, by the way, can you see what they're doing in there? These women who was in an accounting office, they're all working on adding machines, right? Totaling figures. What happened to those jobs today? Those jobs are gone, right? And we can talk a little bit about that process too, but that's a great example of jobs rendered obsolete by modern technology. But again, over the 20th century, okay, the women's labor force participation rates grew. Let me dispose of a myth, however. There's this myth somehow, especially with respect to the U.S., that what happened in the 20th century is something like this. Women didn't work outside the home, right? Women didn't work. 60s, feminist revolution comes, women work, right? And then it keeps going like this. And that's not the way, if you look at the data, it actually grows throughout the 20th century. It goes up a little bit in the 60s, particularly among women with small children. But with the growth in women's labor force participation rates really is a steady growth throughout the 20th century. Again, it takes a tick up in the 60s. But it's not like married women and moms never worked outside the home. In fact, one of the great ironies, if you think about all these 1950s TV shows that portrayed stay-at-home moms, right? If you know American TV, Leave It to Beaver and all these other shows, right? Where that sort of had these idealized portrayals of family life with mom and dad. Dad worked, mom was at home taking care of the kids. All of the actresses who portrayed those stay-at-home moms were working mothers. And it's the interesting question. What did they do with their kids? Well, they were playing this TV character who spent all day taking care of the kids. right? But they were working moms. So it's not like even the image they were portraying was false at the time. There are plenty of working women. If you watch, anyone know Mad Men? If you watch Mad Men, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to Mad Men in a second, right? But there's working women, and that's the most pleasant work environment, but they were working. I want to come back to that. So, what caused this growth in female labor force participation? Well, a couple of things. One, economic growth generated by capitalism increased the demand for labor. Right? We needed more workers, and that meant that the opportunities for women to work were greater. In addition, girls, were getting more education, were more likely to finish high school, parents could afford it, right? More likely to finish college. As a result, their human capital was greater. So the combination of them being more productive and a greater demand for them in the workforce meant higher wages for women. And the higher wages for women induced many of them to enter the workforce who had not before. All right? Of course, the other thing that's happening here is a decrease in the time that was needed to run the household. And there were a couple of things causing this. One we've already talked about, fewer kids. Right? With fewer kids, the time available for married women or moms to work was greater. You simply didn't have to take care of your kids as much at home. But the other thing that was happening at the same time was the rise of household technologies that made it possible to spend less time in the home and get things done. We take for granted dishwashers, clothes washers and dryers, vacuums. Right? We take for granted modern electronic stoves where you turn it and it goes on. Okay? All of those things are 20th century kinds of things. Families in the early 20th century, even in the relatively developed economies, let's say North America, Western Europe, if you didn't have a washer and dryer, you know how long it took on average to clean and dry the clothes for a family of 4?
5 hours.
How? 5 hours?
1 day.
Who said 5 days? 5 days? 3 days. 3 days. Okay, to wash and dry everything. And often, by the way, that meant that girls had to miss a day of school to stay home and help with the family laundry, which you can see would be a problem. Okay? There's a terrific series that aired on the BBC and then was on public television in the United States called 1900 House. And 1900 House was about a British family. It was filmed in 1999. About a British family who agreed to live their lives as if it were 1900. So they refitted a house in London to sort of have 1900 technology and appliances in it. The husband had a job that enabled him to sort of wear 1900 clothes and keep his job. The wife stayed at home. The kids had to wear 1900 clothes and all this kind of stuff. It's fascinating. It's a 4 1-hour episode thing. You can find it. You can probably, I think it's all on YouTube now. It's really, really interesting for a whole bunch of reasons. Among the things that are interesting about it is they retrofitted this house for 1900. But what they still, even though they wanted to make it as real as they could, they still had some anti-fire technology in it, and there was a phone in a closet in case there was an emergency, right? Which, if you think about it for a minute, that's cheating. You really want to live like it's 1900? Then live like it's 1900. No fire protection, no phone, right? But again, we're so modernized, right, that we can't even accept that level of risk that real families in 1900 did. There's a couple funny things in the thing. At one point, I think it's the father has some dental trouble. Okay, so they send him he goes to a dentist who was a guy that collected antique dental instruments, right? And so they kind of like pretend they're going to work on him as if it's 1900, but they really don't. Again, cheating, right? I want the guy with the pedal drill and no Novocaine, right? Let's do it. So with dentistry in the UK, it might be the same today. The other interesting thing about that show is that they had 2 teenage daughters, and there was one. They had to shop as if it was 1900, so they couldn't buy any modern products. But the girls actually cheated on one thing. Anyone want to guess what it was? That they just couldn't bear to live 1900 with respect.
Hair dryer. Hair dryer.
Hair dryer? Nope. You're close. You're very close. Shampoo. They tried to make their own shampoo. It was gross and disgusting, and they could not stand their hair to not be clean, right? And again, it's a little evidence about modern economic growth and our sort of standards of cleanliness and health, right? That if you watch old movies, right, sort of historical movies, you can always, there's one giveaway that it's a movie and not real life, which are people's teeth. Right? All these people in what's the Mel Gibson one? The battle movie. Yeah, Braveheart, right? All these, sort of fierce warriors 100 years ago, they all have beautiful teeth. No, people did not have. Human beings were in constant dental pain for most of history. We don't even think about it now. All right. So anyway, if you have a chance to see 1900 House, it's fascinating. So all these home appliances make life easier. The other thing is that with more wealth, we can purchase market alternatives to all of those things. My favorite example of this, I was talking about this yesterday. Ask for the students. Ask your parents. Let me ask you guys. How often growing up did you eat meals that were either where you went out to eat or you brought something in to eat? How many times a week? 2, 3, maybe? How many times did you have dinner that you didn't cook yourself? Not much?
Once a month.
Once a month? Okay. Zero? Yeah, 0, right? Yeah, for those of us who are a little older, not very much, okay? And again, if I do this with U.S. audiences, right, the students say, oh, we ate out 2, 3 times a week, right, when growing up. I said, now ask your parents how often they did, right? 1, right? 1 a month, right? And so the fact that we eat out more often, that young people today, the families eat out more often. In the United States, it's not uncommon for people to send their clothes out, right, to a dry cleaner, right, or to pay people to mow their lawn, all these kinds of things, right, that we pay for that people used to do themselves. That changes this too, right? That makes it possible for more women to work, and in some ways actually for teenagers to work as well, right? That we don't need the time at home. As I said, this increase in female labor force participation predates the 1960s. I want to suggest, by the way, that the feminist movement was a result, not a cause of this, okay? Of the increase in female labor force participation. Again, think about Mad Men, right? Mad Men, what, 1940s, 1950s. You were a woman working in that world. It was not a good place. Right? You can see why the increase in women's labor force participation rates coming into the workforce might make women kind of radical about equality. Right? I'm not being treated very well in the workplace. Right? That's a reason to want to fight for equal rights, as opposed to gaining equal rights and then going out and working. So to some degree, the feminist movement was a result, not a cause, of this change in labor force participation. The thing that actually mattered more than the feminist movement for women's ability to work outside the home, anyone want to guess what it is? I sort of mentioned it before. Technological medical improvements. Birth control. Right? For the first time in human history, women had control over their fertility and control over contraception that wasn't dependent upon man. Okay? Or at least on an agreement with the man. The ability to control their fertility gave women a great deal more ability to work outside the home and fundamentally transformed, as you can imagine the impact that had on family. Okay? So let's say some things about family in the 20th century then. 2 key things we can note about the wealth that capitalism created. First, women's financial independence. Women in the 20th century became increasingly financially independent. Not all women and not perfectly equal to men, but certainly much more than they had been. That matters a lot for reasons we'll talk about. Secondly, a decline in the benefits of specializing by gender. If you think about what marriage was for a long time, with men earning income outside the home and women managing the house, right? That was a specialization. Economists love this, right? Specialization by comparative advantage, perhaps. Specialization of some sort, right? And that sort of specialization enabled both parties to cooperate to bring income in and then produce the things in the household. But what's happened in the 20th century is that women's human capital structures now look much more like men's. And there's no reason that women can't be out in the marketplace earning a living. At the same time, the need for some of the things that were done in the home isn't there. So marriages don't benefit as much in terms of being specialized by gender. You can see why people historically might want to get married. Men, if they wanted kids, needed someone to care for the kids. Women, if they wanted to have kids, needed someone to bring in the income. Right? Get together, specialized by gender, married, makes sense. But now marriage is less beneficial in that sense, right? Because the benefits of the specialization isn't there the way it used to be. And so one of the interesting things is that marriage offers fewer material benefits than it used to. On the other hand, though, it offers larger emotional, psychological benefits. In fact, now marriage is mostly about love. and family is about love and psychological benefits, not these economic and material ones. If we put these two things together, women's increased financial independence and the declining benefits of marriage, it's not surprising that we have seen a rise in divorce rates. Okay? Let me say a couple things about that real quick. The divorce rate, again, in the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, certainly rose during the 1970s, but it actually peaked in the early 1980s. And since the early 1980s, it's slowly declined. What we're seeing today, it seems like, are fewer marriages, but better marriages. And in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about why that might be. Okay? But that does seem to be one way of interpreting the trend. And why did we see increased divorce rates? Well, economists tend to think in terms of preferences and constraints. So let me lay out what I think that means in this case. As marriage became more and more about love, it was more likely that more marriages would fail to live up to that ideal. Right? If now marriage is this sort of magical, wonderful Disney movie place, right, that you're supposed to be in, the reality is most marriages aren't like that. Okay, most marriages are tough work. Okay, and when people were unhappy in marriages, now that was a reason to leave, right? Because you were supposed to be happy when you were married. For most of human history, being happy wasn't about marriage; it was about being happy, right? You're supposed to see Fiddler on the Roof sometimes. A good story about not being happy, right? People, marriage had functions, right? There were roles you had to fulfill. Being happy wasn't the point, okay? But now being happy is the point. And if being happy is the point, it's more likely that people are going to be unhappy and say, I'm supposed to be happy, I'm unhappy, I want out. So one of the ironies of the love-based marriage is it raised the standard of people's expectation of what marriage is supposed to be. And more marriages fell short of that standard. It's an interesting thing for conservatives to think about, right? Who talk about how important it is that people love each other and stay in stable marriages. Well, the more marriage is about love, the harder it is to sort of achieve that ideal that we tell people they're supposed to achieve. On the constraint side, of course, women had more financial independence. As a result, if they were unhappy or if they were being abused, it was easier for them to get out than it had been historically. So not surprisingly, between these sort of change in preferences and this change in constraints, we saw rising divorce rates. And in some sense, wealth and freedom made this inevitable. And there's no putting that toothpaste back in the tube. There's no realistic, I think, expectation that we're going to go back to a world where divorce rates are like they were in the 30s or 40s or 50s. They may continue to fall slowly, but they're still going to be part of what it means what marriage and family means in the 21st century. And again, in the next lecture, I'll talk some more about that. All right, so what about the 21st century? Well, there's one issue we haven't talked about yet. That's probably the most important one that facing marriage and family issues in the 21st century, and that's the demand for same-sex marriage. Now, I want to talk about this for a little bit, and I'm going to talk about it. I want to sort of talk about it, how it fits in with the rest of the story I'm telling. I don't want to make an argument for or against it necessarily, though my views will be clear as I do this. But I just want to put it in the context of this historical story. So the question I want to ask is, why now? Right? Why in the last 10 or 15 years has this suddenly become the issue, the family issue that people are concerned about? Well, guess what? One of the answers is that the same processes that we've talked about so far in terms of transforming the heterosexual family has transformed the nature of marriage in ways that has made it more open to same-sex couples. So capitalism and the wealth it produced gave us 5 things that sort of all converge in making it understandable that we would see same-sex couples want to sort of join the institution of marriage. Okay? 1, people can survive economically outside the family. Right? The idea that you no longer need to have a spouse and children to survive economically means you can be unmarried and do just fine economically, work in a factory or have your other kind of job or whatever it might be. So when we decoupled earning an income from having a family, right, we made possible people's ability to do that, right, in some sense made it possible for people to survive without the traditional heterosexual family. Another thing that capitalism did was contribute to the rise of large cities And large cities made anonymity possible. One of the things we know about human beings is that human beings have always engaged in same-sex sexual activities. What they haven't done until the last 100 years is identify themselves as, say, gay or lesbian. Right? To think of that as an identity is a relatively recent phenomenon. And one of the reasons for that it's recent is that one could not live one's life that way in a society where everybody is sort of watching you and concerned about your marriage and family decisions. In a city where you can be anonymous, you can live your life that way in a way that's not possible in smaller towns or a farming community or whatever it might be. It's why historically in the evolution of the biggest gay communities and lesbian communities we think about are in big cities, often port cities, where there's lots of opportunity to connect with people from other cultures. The other thing we see happen in the last 100 years is a broader sort of liberal ethos of anything that's peaceful. Right? We can think about civil rights movements, we can think about the loosening of restrictions on what people can read, and what movies people can watch, and all these kinds of things. The idea that if people are engaging in peaceful behavior that's not harming anyone, what do we care about? That sort of, too, contributed to the idea of sort of the popular acceptance of homosexuality in ways that are linked up with the capitalist and democratic revolutions. Right? We've talked about the separation of sex, marriage, and children. And what do I mean by that? Well, look. Thanks to both cultural changes and medical technology, you can have sex but not have kids. Right? You can actually have kids and not have sex. Okay? You can have sex and not be married. You can have kids and not be married. Possibly you can be married and not have sex. Right? But you can be married and not have kids. All these combinations are possible. In ways, historically, those three things just went together. You can only have sex if you were married, you got married so you could have kids, right? And sex with your kids. Right? Now, these things are all split up in ways that they don't necessarily have to go together. Finally, the point we made earlier, the change in marriage to being about love. If you put all of these things together, it's not surprising that we see this demand for same-sex marriage. Because all of these factors contribute to that. The fact that people identify as gay and lesbian, that they might love another human being in the same way that heterosexual couples love each other, and that becomes the basis for their marriage. You don't need to have kids anymore, right? To think that marriage and kids don't necessarily have to go together in a way it did before, right? All of these factors together make it possible, right, for people to think in terms of a same-sex couple being married in a way that wasn't possible for most of human history. And I really want to focus on the idea about the ways in which capitalism led to marriage being about love. Because once marriage becomes about love, you can see why same-sex couples might say, well, wait a second, how are we any different from anyone else? Why should we be allowed into this institution in all these kinds of ways? So again, whatever you think about this topic as a kind of policy question, it shouldn't surprise us that it's in front of us. It's just the extension of this evolutionary process that we've been talking about for the last hour. I think families are really important. Western civilization needs families as these norms and values transmitters. The question of the 21st century, however, is whether multiple forms of the family are all able, or which ones are able, to do the work that families have to do and do it effectively. Families have particular functions they have to perform. Those functions have changed, as we've talked about, right? They've changed over time. And as they change, as the functions that families perform change, the different forms, the different structures that families take change in response. Different kinds of families are better at doing different kinds of things. And so the question is whether all these new family forms that we're seeing arise are able to do the things that families have to do, particularly with respect to children. So let me leave you with my friend Hayek here. I love that picture. When I'm in my 80s, I want big sunglasses like that hanging out. Okay? The liberal position is based on courage and confidence, on a preparedness to let change run its course, even if we cannot predict where it will lead. Okay? And this is Hayek talking very generally about why he was not a conservative, why he's a liberal, in the classical sense of liberal. And I think this has an interesting application in how we think about family issues, right? That, yeah, families changing and evolving in all kinds of interesting ways, all right? But the question is, are we afraid of that change, or are we prepared to let that change run its course with confidence, if we think people are capable of sorting things out and figuring out their own problems and adapting to change in certain sorts of ways, then we're more confident. Free markets produce a social world and a culture that we cannot and should not try to control. Liberalism has what, to use Matt Ridley's phrase, a rational optimism that the results of those processes will be desirable. It was capitalism that turned the family from a repressive patriarchal institution into a loving and far more equal, though certainly not perfectly equal, one. Right? And so when we think about this relationship, one of the nice things for me is that the same forces of economic freedom and economic dynamism that lead to economic growth, and we saw in the last lecture, improve people's well-being, all these sorts of things, also make possible new choices for people, new options for people, and create families that are based upon love and psychological and emotional satisfaction, and not mere instruments of economic rationality. So one of the ironies here is that as the economic forces of capitalism brought more sort of markets and calculation and all these kind of things to the broader society, it emptied that out of families and created space in families for them to be about emotional and psychological satisfaction. The modern family is a much nicer place to be today than the pre-modern family was. And I think the argument that I want to make is that the capitalism, the structures it changed, and the wealth it brought with it are a significant, though not the only, but a significant reason why we've seen that change in the family. So thank you very much.